Dr. Sarah Chen had spent 15 years studying the psychological profiles of the world's most successful executives when she noticed something disturbing. The same mental traits that helped these individuals build billion-dollar empires were systematically destroying their public reputations and personal relationships. It wasn't coincidence, it was psychology. Her breakthrough came while analyzing Elon Musk's Twitter behavior in 2022. What appeared to be random outbursts and impulsive decisions actually followed predictable patterns that Chen had observed in dozens of other ultra-wealthy individuals. She was witnessing the real-time psychological deterioration of people whose brains had been fundamentally altered by extreme success and unlimited power. The phenomenon Chen identified wasn't new, but social media had made it visible in ways that previous generations of wealthy elites had managed to hide. Every controversial tweet, every public meltdown, and every self-destructive decision was now documented and analyzed by millions of observers. The billionaire CEOs of the digital age were performing their psychological breakdowns in public, seemingly unable to stop themselves. Musk's transformation from respected entrepreneur to controversial figure provided the perfect case study for Chen's research. In 2018, Musk was widely admired as a visionary leader who had revolutionized electric vehicles and space exploration. By 2023, his erratic Twitter behavior, controversial statements, and impulsive business decisions had made him one of the most polarizing figures in business. But Chen's analysis revealed that Musk's behavior wasn't random or inexplicable. It followed the same psychological patterns she had documented in other billionaire executives who had self-destructed in public. Viewed. The first pattern Chen identified was what she termed reality distortion, amplification. Ultra-wealthy individuals become accustomed to having their ideas accepted without serious challenge. Employees, business partners, and even family members learn to avoid contradicting someone who controls billions of dollars and thousands of jobs. Over time, this environment creates a psychological feedback loop where the billionaire's sense of reality becomes increasingly detached from objective truth. Musk's Twitter behavior exemplified this pattern perfectly. His tweets about topics ranging from COVID-19 to geopolitics often contradicted established scientific consensus or expert analysis. But rather than moderating his statements when corrected, Musk would typically double down on his positions, seemingly unable to accept that his intuition might be wrong about subjects outside his expertise. The psychological mechanism behind this behavior was rooted in what Chen called success attribution error. Billionaire CEOs develop an unconscious belief that their wealth and success prove their intellectual superiority in all domains, not just the specific areas where they built their fortunes. This cognitive bias makes them overconfident in their opinions about everything from public health policy to international relations. Chen found similar patterns in other tech billionaires. Mark Zuckerberg's congressional testimony about Facebook's role in spreading misinformation revealed the same disconnect between his self-perception as a benevolent innovator and the public's view of him as a threat to democratic discourse. Jeff Bezos's tone-deaf comments about worker conditions at Amazon warehouses showed the same inability to understand how his words would be received by people outside his wealth bubble. The second major pattern Chen documented was empathy erosion syndrome. Her research suggested that extreme wealth and power literally rewired the brain's capacity for empathy and social awareness. Neuroscience studies had shown that wealth activated brain regions associated with addiction, while simultaneously suppressing areas responsible for emotional regulation and social cognition. This neurological change explained why billionaire CEOs seemed incapable of understanding how their actions affected ordinary people. When Musk joked about buying Coca-Cola to put cocaine back in it, he appeared genuinely surprised by the negative reaction. His wealth-altered brain couldn't process that jokes about drug addiction might be offensive to people struggling with substance abuse issues. The empathy erosion was particularly evident in how these executives responded to criticism. Rather than acknowledging legitimate concerns about their business practices or social impact, they typically reacted with defensiveness, counterattacks, or bizarre conspiracy theories. Musk's response to criticism of Twitter's content moderation policies included accusations that his critics were part of coordinated campaigns to destroy free speech, rather than people with genuine concerns about online harassment and misinformation. Chen's research revealed that this defensive pattern was common among ultra-wealthy individuals who had lost the ability to distinguish between legitimate criticism and personal attacks. Their wealth-altered brains interpreted any challenge to their authority as an existential threat, triggering fight-or-flight responses that led to increasingly erratic public behavior. The third psychological pattern Chen identified was stimulation addiction. Escalation. Billionaire CEOs became psychologically dependent on the intense stimulation that came from high-stakes decision-making and public attention. Normal social interactions and routine business operations no longer provided sufficient psychological reward, leading them to seek increasingly extreme forms of stimulation. This addiction explained why Musk seemed compelled to make increasingly outrageous tweets and business decisions. Each controversial statement generated massive public reaction, which provided the psychological stimulation his wealth-altered brain craved. But like any addiction, the behavior required escalation to maintain the same level of reward. The stimulation addiction also explained why these executives seemed incapable of staying out of public controversies, even when their advisors and lawyers begged them to maintain lower profiles. They couldn't resist the psychological reward that came from generating public reaction. The addiction to stimulation overpowered their rational understanding of the damage their behavior was causing to their reputations and businesses. Chen found this pattern in numerous other billionaire executives. Kanye West's increasingly extreme public statements followed the same escalation trajectory. As his wealth and fame increased, Donald Trump's Twitter behavior during his presidency showed the same compulsive need for attention and reaction, regardless of the consequences for his political objectives. The fourth pattern Chen documented was mortality panic response. Ultra-wealthy individuals who achieved extreme success at relatively young ages often experienced existential crises related to their own mortality and legacy. Having accomplished their major life goals by their 40s or 50s, they faced decades of remaining life without clear purposes or challenges. This existential anxiety manifested as increasingly grandiose projects and statements. Musk's claims about colonizing Mars, solving world hunger, or creating artificial general intelligence weren't just business strategies, they were psychological responses to the fear that his life lacked ultimate meaning despite his enormous wealth and success. The mortality panic also explained why these executives became obsessed with their public image and historical legacy. Their controversial statements and erratic behavior often seemed designed to ensure they would be remembered, even if the attention was negative. Being hated was psychologically preferable to being forgotten or irrelevant. Chen's analysis of Twitter data showed that Musk's most controversial tweets typically came during periods when he wasn't receiving sufficient media attention for his business activities. The psychological need for stimulation and legacy validation drove him to make statements that would guarantee public reaction, even when those statements damaged his company's stock prices or his personal reputation. The fifth and most dangerous pattern Chen identified was reality testing failure. Prolonged isolation within wealth bubbles led to complete disconnection from normal social reality. Billionaire CEOs began to believe their own public relations narratives and lost the ability to accurately assess how their behavior appeared to outside observers. This reality testing failure was evident in Musk's apparent surprise at negative reactions to his business decisions and public statements. His wealth-insulated environment had convinced him that his intuitions about public opinion were accurate, even when they were completely wrong. He seemed genuinely confused when policies that made sense within his inner circle generated massive backlash from users, advertisers, and regulators. The reality testing failure created a dangerous feedback loop. As billionaire CEOs made increasingly poor decisions, based on distorted perceptions of reality. They faced more criticism and negative consequences, but instead of correcting their behavior, they typically interpreted the negative feedback as evidence that they were being unfairly targeted, leading to even more erratic and self-destructive responses. Chen found this pattern in the downfall of numerous business leaders. Elizabeth Holmes's persistence with Tyrannos despite obvious technological failures showed the same inability to acknowledge reality. Adam Newman's grandiose claims about WeWork transforming human consciousness revealed similar disconnection from objective business metrics. The research also revealed why traditional corporate governance structures were ineffective at controlling these psychological patterns. Boards of directors and executive advisors were typically selected for their willingness to support the CEO's vision, rather than their ability to provide honest feedback. This created institutional structures that reinforced rather than corrected the psychological distortions caused by extreme wealth. Chen's most disturbing finding was that these psychological patterns were progressive and irreversible. Once billionaire CEOs reached a certain threshold of wealth and power, the neurological changes in their brains made it impossible for them to return to normal social functioning. The same traits that made them successful entrepreneurs, confidence, risk-taking, and vision, became pathological when amplified by unlimited resources and social isolation. The implications of Chen's research extended far beyond individual psychology. The concentration of economic and political power among individuals with predictable psychological dysfunction posed systemic risks to society. When people with wealth-altered brains controlled major corporations, media platforms, and political processes, their personal psychological problems became everyone's problems. Chen's analysis suggested that Musk's Twitter behavior wasn't an aberration, but a preview of how other tech billionaires would behave as they aged and their psychological conditions worsened. The same patterns she observed in Musk were already becoming visible in other ultra-wealthy individuals who had achieved success at young ages. The research also revealed why traditional methods of managing wealthy individuals, public relations advisors, legal teams, and corporate communications departments were ultimately ineffective. These support systems were designed to manage rational actors who wanted to protect their reputations and business interests. But billionaire CEOs with wealth-altered psychology were no longer rational actors making calculated decisions about risk and reward. Chen's work suggested that the only effective intervention would be structural changes that limited the ability of any individual to accumulate the levels of wealth and power that caused these psychological distortions. But implementing such changes would require collective action by societies that were increasingly controlled by the same individuals whose psychology had been damaged by their wealth. The tragedy, according to Chen's analysis, was that these billionaire CEOs weren't evil people who had chosen to become destructive forces. They were victims of psychological changes caused by their own success, trapped in behavioral patterns they couldn't recognize or control. Their wealth had given them unlimited power to act on their distorted perceptions of reality, turning their personal psychological problems into global crises. Musk's Twitter behavior, viewed through Chen's research, wasn't the random actions of an eccentric genius. It was the predictable result of neurological changes that occurred when human brains were exposed to levels of wealth and power that had never existed in human evolutionary history. His controversial statements, impulsive decisions, and apparent inability to understand their consequences were symptoms of a psychological condition that affected most people who achieved similar levels of success. The most chilling implication of Chen's research was that society was likely to see more, not fewer, billionaire CEO meltdowns in the coming years. As wealth inequality increased and more individuals achieved extreme levels of success at young ages, the number of people developing wealth-induced psychological dysfunction would continue to grow. Understanding the psychology behind billionaire behavior didn't excuse their destructive actions, but it did provide insight into why traditional approaches to managing their power, ethics training, legal consequences, and public criticism were ultimately ineffective. You can't reason with someone whose brain has been fundamentally altered by their circumstances. especially when those circumstances continue to reinforce their distorted worldview. Chen's research suggested that the real question wasn't why billionaire CEOs behaved erratically, but why society continued to organize itself around systems that predictably created psychologically damaged individuals and then gave them unlimited power to impose their dysfunction on everyone else. The answer, unfortunately, was that the same systems that created billionaire psychological dysfunction also made those individuals wealthy enough to prevent any structural changes that might address the underlying problem. Society was trapped in a cycle where wealth created psychological damage, and that psychological damage was used to create more wealth concentration, leading to even more severe psychological dysfunction among an ever smaller group of ultra-powerful individuals. Elon Musk's Twitter behavior was just the most visible symptom of this deeper systemic problem. His controversial statements and impulsive decisions weren't personal failings, they were the predictable results of a human brain trying to function in circumstances that human psychology was never designed to handle. And unless something changed about how society distributed wealth and power, Musk's psychological deterioration was just a preview of what would happen to the next generation of tech billionaires who were already showing early signs of the same wealth-induced dysfunction that had transformed a brilliant engineer into one of the most polarizing figures of his era.